Hello, everyone. This is Dennis Sanders, the pastor of First Christian Church Disciples of Christ in Roseville, Minnesota. I hope you're having a good week. So we're continuing our Lenten theme, which is unfinished, discerning God's call in the not yet. And today I want to talk to you a little bit about death. Our text actually is focusing a little bit about death. It's from John 11, verses 1 through 45. When I was finishing up seminary, or actually I had finished seminary, but I had to do something called clinical pastoral education. And I spent about what would be a school year working at a transitional care facility. This was a type of facility where people would be kind of there after a surgery to kind of rehabilitate and then maybe be released, or they were getting ready to go to a nursing home, or they're getting ready to go to a hospice. One of the first memories, one of the first things I remember doing as a chaplain at this home, a facility, was they ushered me into the room. And this was a man that was sitting, he was actually in the bed, pretty much comatose. He had brain cancer. And I remember being asked to pray for him, and the wife saying that they were hoping that he would get better and maybe go to some place where he could rehabilitate. And I remember looking at him thinking, this man has cancer, and it's bad enough that he is not even aware that anyone else is in the room. And I remember the challenge of trying to pray for this man. You don't want to pray something that's not going to happen, but you also don't want to pray as if God can't do something. And that was a challenge. I do know that at some point he was transferred to hospice. And I always think about that family having to come to the conclusion that their loved one was never going to get better, that they had to face that their loved one was going to die. It's always interesting thinking about superheroes because they're always there to try to save people. And I think one of the most interesting things is when they aren't able to do something, when they aren't able to save someone and someone dies as a result. That here is all this power, and yet they couldn't do what they feel that they were called to do. And I think about that a lot in today's text. Today's text is about the raising of Lazarus from the dead. Lazarus was a good friend of Jesus. Actually, he, along with his two sisters, Mary and Martha, were all good friends of Jesus. And the chapter opens when we found out that Lazarus is sick. But strangely, Jesus doesn't immediately go and find out how he's doing. He doesn't necessarily contact Mary and Martha. He kind of basically says something that harkens back to something that he had said earlier in John 9 with the man born blind, that what was happening so that it could show that God was working. Well, later into the chapter, we find out that Lazarus dies. Jesus finally makes his way to Bethany, the town where the three lived. And he first catches up with Martha. And Martha, you can see a twinge of resentment in her voice. She says in Scripture, in verse 21, Lord, if you had been here, my mother would have not died. But even now, I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him. She knows that God could do something through Jesus. And you can tell she was upset and wondered, why weren't you here? But still, she has hope that God can still do something through Jesus. She doesn't know what, but she believes. Later, Mary and Martha take Jesus out to the tomb, and he's surrounded by all these people who are mourning the passing of Lazarus, and it gets to him. He is deeply moved. And at some point, the scripture says that he weeps. Some scholars think that when they say that he's deeply moved, it's not simply that he was sad, though he was sad. I think it's important to remember that. But he was also upset. Some would say angry. Angry about the power of death in our world. Jesus was going to raise Lazarus. As that old gospel song goes, it's kind of the Mary, don't you weep, Martha, tell Martha not to moan. But the fact of the matter is, at that moment, Jesus is facing the fact that Lazarus is dead. There was nothing that could be done at that point, it seemed. Lazarus wasn't coming back. And yet, that is the world that we live in. People are alive and they die. Death still reigns in our world. I remember seeing this video on the civil rights movement many years ago. And it's a scene that focuses on the funeral of one of the 3 civil rights workers that were killed in Mississippi in the mid-1960s. During that funeral, you saw the face focusing on the face of the younger brother. He is singing aloud a hymn, and you can see tears streaming down his face. And that face is a mixture of sadness and anger. Sad because he is mourning his big brother, and anger because of the injustice of it all. Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead, in fact, seemed impossible because he had been dead for 4 days. This was at the point where people would believe he's not coming back. He's dead. Dead. Nothing's happening. And yet, Jesus calls forth Lazarus from the grave and back into life. Jesus told Martha early on, just when Lazarus was still in the grave, that he is the resurrection and the life. Death would ultimately not have power. It would not have the last word. It wouldn't have the last word over Lazarus, and it definitely would not have the last word over Jesus when he would ultimately be killed. We rejoice because we know that in Jesus death is defeated, but we still live in a world where there is death. I'm reminded a few years ago watching the funeral of former President George H.W. Bush, and his oldest son, George W. Bush, also a former president, gave the eulogy. And at one moment, he loses his composure. At that moment, you know that he is not a former president remembering a fellow former president, but he's a son mourning the passing of his father. That is the world that we still live in. We live in a world where we mourn our friends and our family who die, especially those who die way too soon. But the thing is that we have hope. What this passage teaches us is that we know that Jesus has defeated death. And even when we remember and we mourn our loved ones, we know one day death will die. And we know that God is always with us. Take care, dear friends. Godspeed, and I'll see you soon.